Before we start, I'd just like to announce that this channel now has a Patreon page. If you like this video and would like to see others like it, please consider donating. Membership tiers on the page will allow you access to a number of different rewards, including some behind-the-scenes looks at the creation of these videos, early access to drafts of them as well, monthly Q&As, and exclusive access to deep-diving short videos about topics related to what's covered in the main videos. Thank you very much for watching, and now without further ado, let's take a look at the games of System SACOM. There are some companies in Japan for whom software development is only temporary. Their primary interest might be in hardware or electronics or the casino industry. But given the profit in software development in the first half of the 1980s in Japan, some would dip their toes in, and one in particular would stay in that water until the turn of the millennium. Shifting from their primary focus as an electronic parts developer, they would remain a small studio, but would also become a major influence in the industry. From becoming part of the shift of the PC-98 from businesses to homes, with the help of a software developer so reclusive that debates are still held as to whether or not he even existed, to creating a hugely influential series of games that would be fundamental in establishing the visual novel genre, and then finally working on many different titles for computer and console systems, before finally bowing out of the industry completely and reverting to their original focus of being a manufacturer of electronic components. This is the story of System SACOM. Founded in 1981, System SACOM started out as a hardware manufacturer. One of the most prominent products they created was the amusement board AMD-98, an expansion card which added music functions and joystick terminals to NEC's PC-98 line of computers. At the time, this was somewhat unusual. Created in response to IBM's 5150 line of business computers, the PC-98's primary function was as a machine for offices, having a rapid adoption and quickly becoming the standard for business computing in Japan. While many businessmen were getting units for their homes, their primary purpose as a machine for business productivity was the common conception of people at the time. One designer, though, had a different opinion. Looking back on it in an interview with gpara.com, game designer Mark Flint stated that he was intrigued by a new graphics accelerator chip put into PC-98 models in 1985, in addition to the AMD-98. This card was called the Graphic Charger, or GRCG, and it allowed that system to have much greater color range. From these hardware enhancements, Mark Flint believed that he could develop his own games for the PC-98 platform, and that it might eventually become a strong machine for entertainment. Mark Flint is an interesting person, highly reclusive. He has not been in any photographs that research was able to uncover, and most of his answers have been through email only in interviews. Due to his elusive nature, many bloggers, writers, and discussion boards in both Japanese and English have cast doubt on whether he even existed, instead theorizing that he might have been a pseudonym, or created as an advertisement persona for System SACOM, similar to how Mavis Beacon is a fictional character made to promote typing programs in the United States. There are some reasons why these theories gain traction. Flint's backstory of being a programmer from Pasadena, Texas, gaining interest in the PC-98 through exposure, is unlikely. It just wasn't that common in America at the time. However, it's not impossible. While NEC didn't market the PC-98 in the USA specifically, they did market the APC series, which had similar hardware and started to go in the direction that the PC-98 would eventually go. Recently, however, the debate over Mark Flint's existence was quelled a bit when an ebook was published online by Hiroshi Ogino, a former developer at SACOM, describing Flint in much greater detail. From his description, we can get a much better picture of Flint's backstory. According to the ebook, Mark Flint was Japanese, but spent time either personally or professionally in Texas. In the ebook, Ogino further goes on to state, "My impression of Mr. Flint was that he was a genius-like, extremely serious, STEM-oriented IT engineer. He seemed different from the relatively laid-back people at SACOM. I remember him wearing a suit. He was logical, and his thought process seemed almost like that of a computer. However, I felt a great sense of comfort in his genius." Mark Flint would create several games for the PC-98, and while simplistic, they would set the foundation for what was to come. The first was Valiant, a rudimentary space shooter similar to the Star Wars arcade game. While not quite as intricate, it plays similarly. This would be followed up by Moonball, a simple pinball game that would later get a greatly expanded Famicom port called Moonball Magic. The Flint games would get more complex with Brown's Run, an action puzzle game in which the player controls a little ball that has to eat blue dots while avoiding red ones, ricocheting the balls around and also creating holes in the floor to try to redirect them. It's a tricky but enjoyable game. There would also be some experimentation with sprite scaling with Flint's game Zone, which is sort of like a prototypical Space Harrier. This experimentation would continue with Highway Star, a racing game. This game has nice 3D graphics for the time, and a great sense of motion. Highway Star would get some media attention, being featured at the Tohoku Motor Expo. These 5 games would be collected in a re-release in 1991 for the PC-98 called All About Mark Flint. But in keeping in nature with Mark Flint's elusiveness, the face in the front of the box is pixelated and most likely wasn't Mark Flint's to begin with. And all evidence of his existence was kept down to his distinctive signature. Mark Flint would continue working for SACOM on and off for the next 15 years, and his other contributions will show up later on in this video. Although his games were very basic, they proved what him and SACOM had set out to do, show the viability of the PC-98 as a gaming platform. At this point, though, something else entirely would increase SACOM's view in the public eye. While talking about Flint's games in a March 1984 issue of Login magazine, SACOM representatives mentioned their plans to reach out to adult audiences with more mature stories that would feel like reading a book, and the resulting games and systems that came from that would change their direction as a company and help influence the direction of games in Japan as a whole. Koichi Sato, an employee at System SACOM, wrote in their first ever monthly, The Inside Affair of System SACOM column in the November of 1987 issue of Micom Basic magazine, "People who love games to the point of obsession are not necessarily fit for planning or programming. What I want is something new, not yet another game. I want to be able to freely create things that haven't existed in the game industry until now. Something that captivates players and transports them to unknown realms. That's what I'm striving for. We are now working on NovelWare, which is a new genre of software yet to be known, and that's why the air is so intense." These games are accompanied by exquisite soundtracks and delicate graphics captured by an image scanner. As we move closer to release, the excitement intensifies. Such games will be the epitome of NovelWare and bring forth a new genre of amusement through the efforts of our programming team. Well, we will be going in a very different direction than the videos I'm about to mention, with a deep dive on the 7 games in the NovelWare series, as well as the rest of SACOM's library. BowlOfLentils video on the origin of visual novels gives a great overview of the concept of visual novels and this and many other series. It's a great resource for learning about more of the influence that these and other games had on visual novels in Japan. Also, the YouTuber FamiConsumer, who I was made aware of while this video was being finalized, has a look at the Mansion of Hidden Souls game and uses some of the same citations that show up in this video. Both videos are very much worth a watch, and I'll link them in the description. Yutaka Tama, an editor of multiple tabletop gaming RPGs, as well as books on game criticism, and the editor of the Japanese version of Warlock magazine, was one of the members in charge of this new direction. Following up on the idea stated in the article, he wanted to create a series of simple adventure games that adults would find accessible enough to play easily, and intriguing enough to play them to the end, as well as replay them. The reality of this would turn out a little different, as the NovelWare games would vary across their releases in terms of interactivity and theme. The first game, Dome, was based on a novel by the author Shizuko Natsuki, famous for her mystery novelizations, and having written over 80 novels that have had multiple media adaptations. Both the novel, Dome, Prelude to the End, and the game concern the construction of the Dome, the largest man-made structure ever built. When adapting the novel, which is sprawling and covers many countries and events, Tama wisely decided to focus on one aspect of the plot and one set of characters. The setup is interesting. A woman made ill by Los Alamos bomb testing and her engineer husband have come up with a plan to build this structure in order for humanity to survive through a nuclear war should it occur. And a company in Japan is trying to make that dream possible, with the protagonist of the game in charge of the fundraising. If millions of people donate a small amount, it's possible to do this. But all of this must be done, and interest must be gained, with the added wrinkle of the construction and fundraising being performed in secret. Because if private agencies, government, or press found out about it, they could interfere and put a stop to the construction. Dome has elements of a management simulator as the game gets underway. Player choices are made from a large menu system in which the player must decide which actions to pursue to meet fundraising before deadline. To prevent brute forcing commands, every action the player chooses takes time away from a clock, forcing them to be strategic about their actions. This has caused the game to earn a reputation of having a high degree of difficulty, and Dome seriously lives up to it. Choosing the inappropriate action, or spending too much time on irrelevant actions, can lead to a quick game over, or lock you into a path for the worst ending. There are some social satire elements to Dome. In order to try to get the Dome built, the protagonist and their company have the idea of reps standing around public places wearing strange hats and giving people somewhat cryptic information and a phone number, then selling them fully on the donation idea when people call in. This bizarre situation actually leads into one of the most difficult puzzles in the game, where the player must figure out how not to reveal the Dome to the public when information about the construction is leaked to the press. Dome has a very strange mood about it. There is a kind of melancholy absurdity to the whole thing that is palpable through every word of the game. The juxtaposition of the silly marketing plans to construct the Dome, mixed with the very sad story of the bomb survivor and engineer husband, make the game feel jarring, and the music adds to that creepy atmosphere, switching between bright pieces and quite somber and unsettling ones at a moment's notice. Another way that the NovelWare games innovated was in presentation. They tend to give the player a lot of information at once, and in Dome, this is used to raise tension. Multiple windows appear on the screen at one time, splitting between narration, dialogue, and relevant contextual information, and there's usually something to read at any point during the game. The effect here is to give the player a sense of feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the task, and it succeeds. In the X68000 port, mouse control is implemented, allowing the user to move the windows around a little, and that helps. But the feeling of staring at an incredibly daunting uphill battle never really goes away. Graphically, the game makes the decision to use pictures of real individuals, mostly System SACOM employees, to represent the characters in the game. While this sort of thing would become much more common in the future, it was unusual at this time, and SACOM would use this as part of their publicity, with employees talking about this process in their monthly column for MyCom Basic magazine. Dome was an incredibly unusual game to head out of the gate with. Constantly shifting in tone, it asked questions about who we are as humans. What happens when corporations claim altruistic motives but still want to make a profit? And the role of government in keeping the machines of war going. Alternately deeply somber and lightly funny, its ambition exceeded its grasp a little, but its themes remain resonant, and it's well worth a play. Just have a walkthrough nearby. The release dates of future titles in NovelWare would juggle around a lot. This would cause their promotional column in MyCom Basic to change, and it would now keep fans up to date on release dates and reasons for frequent delays. With this would come a new writer for the column, a young man named Manabu Saito, and he was very good at his job. Adopting a relaxed demeanor and talking to the fans directly, holding fan art contests and creating giveaways for roughly 3 years. But Manabu Saito had a much bigger role in the company than just answering fan letters. A classical musician by trade, and a child prodigy, he had already studied at the University of Vienna in composition. With System SACOM, Manabu Saito would write hundreds of pieces, and most of the rest of this video will feature his work. But nowhere is his classical background more evident than in the second NovelWare game, a hybrid management sim and adventure game satirizing the Japanese PC game industry called Soft and Hard Story. The music for this title would be extensive, and it would consist almost entirely of remixed versions of classical pieces. The game is a meta-satire of SACOM itself, with the fictional Mocha Systems Corporation taking the place of it. The protagonist is the son of the head of the game development company, and they are put in charge of Mocha Systems after their father falls seriously ill. The protagonist must lead his team, deal with staff issues, make a product solid enough to review well, and do all of this while making sure to develop a surefire hit title for Mocha, as their previous game, Dame, has become extremely successful and brought attention to the company, bringing with it a now very picky and very vocal fan base. This is a very funny game, and even filtered through translation software plugged into a second translation software, it had me laughing consistently. There are also, like Dome, management elements to the game, where the protagonist must make decisions within a limited schedule of which employees to talk to, whether or not he should help out on the floor, and other various duties. The time limit returns, but the photographic style has been replaced by a softer sketch style, emphasizing the light atmosphere. Taking into account complaints about the difficulty, this game was made much easier than Dome, and it's a bit shorter to complete, only taking about an hour or two. This had a mixed response, and there was some criticism leveled at System SACOM for making their game too easy and too short. Soft and Hard Story is a great palate cleanser after Dome, and although it's short, it's very replayable due to the large size of the cast and flexibility allowed for the protagonist's actions. It's charming, and would do well enough that a sequel would come out later on. Taking into account user and magazine criticism over Soft and Hard Story 1's difficulty, the sequel, Soft and Hard Story 2, was designed to make up for it, and it went a little bit too far in on the difficulty, causing a much longer game where it was almost impossible to get to the best ending. The sequel concerns the protagonist from the first game returning to work at the company since his father has recovered, in a newer and smaller role as a scenario designer, where he must deal with both his former subordinates as new co-workers, and a star programmer causing tension among the team. The graphics are slightly improved, but it's essentially more of the same story, just a lot longer and a lot more difficult. The flags in this game are so tricky that the site Retro PC Game Streaming Radio, which has been a citation source for multiple videos on this channel, was so frustrated by this that they broke down the statistical probabilities and necessities of each individual flag in the game, and the most optimal choice to get the best ending. Because of the complexity required to pull this off, the walkthrough is one of the longest articles in the site, and I'll link it in the description. Sha-Ti, the next NovelWare game in the series, is closer to a conventional science fiction adventure game, and has a more traditional menu system similar to contemporary releases. This time around, the game is about Julius Lynch, an employee at a science lab who finds out that his supervisor has been murdered. Accused of the crime, he escapes into another dimension to track down the killer, and ends up in a small mining town on another planet. Sha-Ti had a troubled development, where multiple ports were planned, but due to myriad technical issues, it would only come out as an exclusive to the PC-88. Part of the reason for this was that Sha-Ti would be the first to use the novel generator system, a system which, after completion of the game, would create a novel-like printout and readout, based on your actions in the game, switching the narrative to third person and adding in additional details and plot points. There are also some randomized elements to the game, like the identity of the murderer. Sha-Ti would have a grittier and more adult tone than the previous games, jettisoning the satirical elements of Dome and telling a darker and more oppressive story. It has more violence and nudity, and is about similar to an R-rated film. The game has multiple endings, but most of them are dead-end paths or death screens due to forgetting to take an item or perform an action. Sha-Ti was written by Sanpei Kamada, a translator and writer of many, many game books, as well as an editor on some tabletop gaming RPGs. He still works as a translator to this day, translating popular American novels. A more realistic pencil drawing black and white style was used for this game, adapted from these late 1970s style illustrations and very colorful drawings of the characters used in advertising for Sha-Ti. Other than the procedural generation, this is a perfectly solid adventure game, and an interesting game to play through. The next game, though, would overshadow it, if not in gameplay, but in story. 38 Mon Kilo no Koku, or 380,000 Kilometers of Void, the next entry in the NovelWare series, is by far the most serious of the NovelWare games. A more strict visual novel, it tells the story of mankind building a giant international space station in the hope of moving towards a brighter future after nuclear war has ravaged the Earth. As the opening ceremony for the space station is set to begin, 3 reporters are set to evaluate it to figure out if the opening is a benefit or detriment to humanity. 380,000 Kilometers of Void is inspired by both hard science fiction novels like Arthur C. Clarke's The Fountains of Paradise, as well as the paranoid atmosphere of 1970s conspiracy thrillers. As the protagonist, Kei Izuma, and his 2 co-workers begin to investigate and document the events on the station, they notice increasing military presence, holes in people's stories, and a growing feeling they're only being shown what people want them to see, leading to them all to become involved in a political struggle as they and the player wrestle with whether the ends justify the means and if the future of humanity is worth the squabbling and gamesmanship going on behind the scenes as the space station reaches its activation. This game would jettison most adventure game elements, with most choices boiling down to whether or not to take a skeptical or enthusiastic viewpoint, although there is an excellent put the dots of the conspiracy together puzzle near the middle of the game. The pencil-drawn art remains strong, but it's the deep quality of the writing here, intricately discussing scientific and political concepts, that is the real star of the show. It's not for everyone, but if you're interested in the most real feeling of the novels, and the mixture of discussing hard science fiction concepts like orbital docking in the future mixed with socio-political ones, such as the responsibility of humanity towards themselves and future generations, appeal to you, this game comes highly recommended, and was my favorite of all the NovelWare games when researching this video, by a significant margin. There would be one final game in the NovelWare series, split across 2 releases. Yami no Ketsuzoku, The Predestined Homicides 1 and 2, are horror mystery games which tell the story of a young fashion designer with incredibly keen powers of observation. After meeting with an old friend, she finds out from her workplace that a coworker and another close friend have been found dead, completely drained of blood. As the bodies begin to pile up, she must investigate the murder in Japan, and her story will eventually take her to Mexico to confront the supernatural forces responsible. This is more of a conventional verb-list adventure game, although the options seriously narrow as the game progresses. The graphics are the best in the series, but the writing takes a hit here, trying to balance the dark tone of the horrific events of the game with the protagonist's optimistic views. It's also got a rather unique narrator and protagonist, who could best be described as bubbly. She ended up being a little polarizing, with as much of a fan base in Japan as detractors. It's easy to see why. Despite being wildly different than the usual stoic detective of this sort of story, she tends to be overly enthusiastic at first, using an overabundance of cute metaphors, which don't really work given the seriousness of the story. While this evens out, especially in the second title, audience enjoyment of this was varied, with some greatly enjoying the unusual protagonist, and some finding her to be frustrating to parse the events of the game through. Another mark against Predestined Homicides was the critical errors were made here in these 2 releases that would have irritated contemporary users, and these may have contributed to the end of the NovelWare line. For one thing, the story ends in the first game just as it is getting interesting, and the previous trademarks of multiple endings or paths are almost completely absent here. The game is also rather short. This gives the impression that all you're really playing in the first Predestined Homicides game is a demo for the much more important second game in the series. There is even an ad once beating the game, urging you to buy the upcoming second part to experience the full and real story of the game. The second game is also much more linear, and runs into yet another tonal issue. The first game is relatively bloodless, and given that and the protagonist's attitudes, you would be forgiven for thinking it was aimed at a younger audience. The second game is very much not that, and is a hard R with some nudity and gore. While the intention here was to ramp up the horror as you got towards the end of the game, it works against the game series here. Taking these factors into account, there would be 2 attempts at re-releases of Yami no Ketsuzoku. First, a compilation release for the FM towns, and then a reimagined version with completely different art and a much more even tone released for the PC Engine CD. However, the damage was done. The muted reception to this game, in addition to the simple fact that adventure games were going out of style in Japan at the moment of Yami no Ketsuzoku's release, meant that this would be the last of the NovelWare line. However, adventure games wouldn't be the only genre that SACOM would make a mark in. Another major game in System SACOM's lineup was Märchen Veil. Designed by Yukio Horimoto and Koichi Sato, the game is an overhead view RPG similar to The Legend of Zelda, taking a lot of inspiration from German folklore. While it didn't have the level of storytelling intricacy that titles in the NovelWare line did, it did take some cues from them, having illustrated cards at the beginning of each chapter explaining the plot. It's a sequel of sorts to a simple puzzle game from SACOM's early days called Womb, but it goes in a much different direction. Märchen Veil concerns the Prince of the Lake of Felix, a warrior who is transformed by a wizard into a strange goat-like creature. He must fight to get back to his human form, making deals with and working for the various gods of his realm. Since Märchen Veil predates The Legend of Zelda, it feels a little rough around the edges in some ways. The prince moves a little sluggishly, and it's hard to line up where you need to be sometimes. It still has tons of atmosphere, though, with the storybook sequences feeling like just rewards for getting through a difficult area. It's also a game that doesn't pull its punches, with a very shocking ending for the time. Upon completing his tasks for the various gods, the Prince of Felix finds out that because his sword is stained with blood, and has been even before the events of the game occurred, he lacks the pure soul to return to humanity and must still atone for his actions. A surprisingly heavy ending for the game. Märchen Veil would end up being a decent hit for the company, and was ported to multiple computer systems. That being said, Yukio Horimoto was getting tired of working for SACOM and wanted to strike out on his own, eventually leaving to form his own company, Infinity, after making some money from developing and selling file management software. Before leaving, though, he would work on the sequel, Märchen Veil 2, but would leave before it was finished, with different people at the company finishing the game. Märchen Veil 2 completes the story of the Prince of the Lake of Felix, with him braving many realms, including Hell itself, to regain his humanity. It just wasn't as popular, though, being only released on the PC-98 due to the staff changes, and when Project Egg released it a couple of years back, they themselves noted that most people had never seen the ending of the second game. Märchen Veil would also get a remix of sorts for the Famicom, which combined levels from both games, but maintained the ending of the first game. The Prince of Felix would end up being a popular character, with multiple game books written starring him both before and after his affliction. One of his character designers, Tetsuya Ishii, would go on to work for the Earthbound series. While Yukio Horimoto would never regain the rights to Märchen Veil, having moved on to the games produced by Infinity, he still brings it up in interviews from time to time that he was very proud of this game. System SACOM would also have other experimental games that didn't quite catch on enough to be part of a series. However, they remain memorable for what they attempted and the diverse ideas they brought to the RPG formula. The game Euphoria is a side-scrolling action-adventure game with RPG elements that introduces a rarely seen idea for the time. It introduces same-screen co-op, allowing a second player to join the game. This game tells the story of Raphael and Falarum, a brother and sister searching for medicine for their ill mother. While searching for the cure, they will become involved in a power struggle between members of a church with ties to their family. Euphoria plays a little roughly, and the difficulty is high, but it's a solid game, moving towards what would eventually become Metroidvanias. Developed around the same time as Euphoria, but released much later, is Valna, a game that combined a lot of popular ideas of the time and merged it with some of the design principles that SACOM was utilizing in their NovelWare series. In Towns, the game is a side-scroller, with text boxes and adventure game commands, as well as a text-based combat system. Once you go outside into the world, though, the game becomes an overhead view similar to the Ys series and switches to real-time combat. The music is also universally fantastic, being one of Manabu Saito's strongest works. While Valna feels very much like an action RPG, it doesn't have experience points or character levels, instead upgrading the character through finding upgrades or buying better gear. It was advertised as having branching paths through the use of NovelWare, but that system ended up not in the final release. Despite being one of the more ambitious efforts of System SACOM, and despite all the efforts put forth on Valna, it did not sell well. Delays forced it to release around the same time as an RPG from Micro Cabin Zack series, which had a lot of publicity and had much greater standing at the time. And the Zack game would go on to massively outsell Valna, and relegate it to the status of a cult classic. Also related to these games, we have Providence, a straight-up action RPG about a man trying to save his island from an evil witch. Providence would be one of the last games that Manabu Saito would work on due to increasing illness, and was one of his strongest soundtracks. Other RPGs released for Japanese computer systems included Power Singer, Alliance Saga, a very graphically advanced RPG for the time, that is set in a world where bards are both highly regarded and incredibly feared, as their powers can be used to topple armies. While Power Singer is graphically amazing, It's unfortunately fairly standard in its gameplay. Despite that, it's worth noting for its ambition. Moving outside the RPG genre, SACOM would also release some interesting software for computer platforms. Yurei-kun, also known as Mr. Ghost, is a fun action game for the MSX with puzzle elements, amazing music, and tricky boss fights. It's also had a fan translation that's been around for a long time, although it can cause issues with emulation. This game was about a man waking up to find himself transformed into a ghost. With no information as to why, he must travel through the underworld to speak to its lord, to find out more information. System SACOM would also publish the game Metal Sight for the Sharp X68000, a kind of Space Harrier clone developed by Finland Cafe, and they would also work on the X68000 ports of the arcade games Gemini Wing and Atomic Robo Kid. They would also branch out into an attempt at a strip quiz game with the game Michio Dreamy. However, the game would not end up very good, and the writing would end up terrible. So this would be the last time that SACOM would attempt anything like this. Lastly, Mark Flint would have another game credited to his design, a first-person shooter for the FM Towns called Evolution. More similar to cave-flying games and the games like Magic Carpet than Doom or Wolfenstein. It feels almost like a rail shooter. Flint would maintain his elusiveness on this title, not even showing up to its own premiere at a computer show and sending another SACOM employee in his stead. The popularity of the NovelWare series, as well as the large number of translators on their staff, would also cause them to work more directly with other companies on 3 different joint ventures. The first was Session 61, a forming of multiple games companies in order to make games for the Gulf Force anime and manga franchise, only releasing 1 game before going under, and canceling 2 planned sequels, as well as any possible Western release. The second, and more successful, was Scap Trust, a joint venture that released games such as Deep Dungeon. And the last was the Disc Original Group, or DOG, a group of developers led by Square, with the intention of bringing Japanese PC developers into the console space. These projects would share people and resources, and it wasn't uncommon for more than one to be listed on produced games. In addition to this, SACOM would also develop several games for consoles just by themselves. For 8-bit systems, there would be another Mark Flint game, a very challenging vertical-scrolling action game about a caveman called Fire Rock. Mark Flint would also work in the 16-bit era on Jerry Boy, a platformer about a man turned into a blob that would have music support from a young Akira Yamaoka, and have staff working on it from game magazine to game publisher Game Freak before Pokemon would make them much more famous. Unfortunately, though, it was around this time that multiple problems would begin to hit System SACOM all at once. A game that they had been touting as their killer app, Wondrous Magic, had begun to run into development difficulties that would worsen over time, with a normally amicable company in deep conflict with each other about direction and tone. Even with Koichi Sato directly involved on the floor, and Hiroshi Ogino and others working on debugging and balance, it just did not come together. And a chance to work on software for a CD-ROM version of the Super Nintendo would fall apart as well, with Nintendo bowing out of that, stopping production of a game called Fortessa in the process. Worst of all, though, Manabu Saito, the brilliant composer and de facto voice of the company, had suffered a massive decline in his health, and he would pass away due to kidney failure at the age of 22. This tragedy, loss, and conflict would mark a shift for the company. The very troubled Wondrous Magic would be knocked back to being an SNES title only, and have only 2 people working on it in the end to debug it and perform quality assurance, causing massive balance issues in the second half of the game. While Wondrous Magic did eventually make it out the door in 1993, it was in a severely limited state. And while the employees of SACOM did what they could to try to restore motivation and balance, releasing a parody fighting game on BBS for free called Kickmaster 2. It would take them a while to get back to strength, instead focusing on various ports, like a top-down version of Road Blaster, similar to Spy Hunter, and a tennis game that was localized here as Jennifer Capriati Tennis. Looking for a new direction, SACOM would fall back on what they were best at. While they didn't solely work on this genre from this point onward, it would be in the adventure game genre where SACOM would put their primary focus. Going from the Sega CD, to the 3DO, to the Saturn and PlayStation. And while these titles would vary in quality, they were always interesting and unique, and allowed the company to get some of their more experimental nature back. Mansion of Hidden Souls, called Tale of the Dream Mansion in Japan, and Yomemi's Mystery Mansion in Europe, is a horror game that plays a bit like The Seventh Guest. A brother and sister are observing a butterfly in a field. The sister becomes so entranced by the butterfly that she runs away after it into a mysterious mansion. Her brother must explore it to rescue her, while dealing with ghosts taking the form of butterflies that alternately help and hinder him. Later in the game, a 1-hour time limit is introduced in which the player must solve puzzles and escape, or be trapped in the mansion forever. While not as creepy as it tries to be, Mansion of Hidden Souls has a pretty good atmosphere, helped by a soundtrack by future Whisper of the Heart composer, Yuji Nomi. Mansion of Hidden Souls would get a sequel on the Sega Saturn, the confusingly named The Mansion of Hidden Souls. In this game, you actually play as one of the butterfly spirits inside the house, tasked with finding out why the magic of the place is weakening with the appearance of a blood moon. While graphically upgraded, it doesn't feel as tense or as creepy as its predecessor, and the replacement of the butterfly spirits with oddly drawn floating heads, with even worse voice acting, ends up being more comical than frightening. There would also be a spiritual sequel to these games for the Sega Saturn in Toriko, released in the United States as the game Lunacy. An amnesiac wakes up in prison and finds himself in a strange place called Misty Town. Tasked with finding a mystical city of moons by the town's tyrannical mayor, he must find and free multiple souls in order to achieve his goal. For the 3DO, SACOM would develop 2 pieces of software. The first, Seal of the Pharaoh, is a kind of FMV dungeon crawler set inside a pyramid. And the second wasn't a game at all, but a virtual recreation of an art museum in Japan. Another FMV series with horror elements from this time is Dracula Detective, having one of SACOM's more outlandish setups. In the future year of 2238, time travel has now become possible. But crimes can now be committed that use time as a component. Due to the baffling nature of such crimes, the police force of the future can hire out consulting detectives to assist. The best of these is Raizo, a man descended from a vampiric human tribe with extremely powerful powers of observation. Together with his assistant Kirihime, they are friends and his Time Rider time machine. He sets out to solve difficult cases while also looking for his lost sister. The first game in the series, Maboroshi no Lorelei, sees Raizo travel back to a historical German Zeppelin in order to help a woman solve a mystery related to her ancestry. It's an adventure game with a lot of pre-rendered cutscenes, and is similar to Mansion of Hidden Souls games, with a first-person perspective for the gameplay sequences. It also has one of the longest introduction videos of the generation, lasting over half an hour and taking up the vast majority of the first disc of the game. While the first game is mostly serious once the plot gets underway, there's a lot of comedy, with a lot of banter between Raizo and his young assistant. The second game in the series ups the comedy a large amount, and punctures the mythos of the protagonist quite a bit. A prequel, a good portion of it takes place in Raizo's home base in the future, and with many more scenes in the third person, as well as a much more cartoony style, we get to see a lot more about Raizo. And, He's a bit of a comical character, far from the eccentric straight man of the first game. Vain and amusing in various ways, he has a pet turtle that he dotes on more than any other human that he meets, and he calls himself a Dracula detective because he figures it's a classier way of referring to himself than as a half-vampire. He remains intelligent and perceptive, if very quickly exasperated. The game tells the story of how Raizo and his assistant Kirihime met, as she was brought along by one of her high school friends when they were seeking out Raizo's help with another ancestral mystery, this time involving ancient China. Upon traveling there, though, the trio find themselves pursued by the time police for violating causality just as soon as they land. And while trying to escape from them, the characters end up in a mysterious dimension called the Time Sargasso, and it's up to Raizo to piece together the mystery, figure out why the time police are after him, and escape from being lost in time. Another adventure title for the PlayStation was The Witch of Salzburg, which switches between an overhead and first-person perspective. It's another horror adventure, this time about a group of students that investigate a castle in Austria and find themselves at the mercy of a witch who had vanished before being burned at the stake. SACOM's PlayStation games also received 2 excellent fan translations recently, allowing us to look at those titles in greater detail. R*MJ The Mystery Hospital is another FMV adventure game that talks about 3 individuals stuck in a hospital after a deadly virus is released outside. While it's mostly an adventure game very similar to the formula laid down by Mansion of Hidden Souls, the menu occasionally gives the character options to use the abilities of the 5 senses of the characters in the game to figure out puzzles. Additionally, there are multiple paths in this game that lead to different endings. SACOM's work on adventure games for both the PlayStation and Saturn would also take on a much more experimental tone. This tone can best be seen in their partnerships with other artists and companies, starting with a second recently released fan-translated title, Iblard, The World of Hatching Laputa, a 3D adventure game based on the works of the artist Naohisa Inoue, in which the player character is stuck in the fantasy world of the artist, and must work to get out of it by solving puzzles and avoiding dangers. Having painted Iblard in various forms of media over the years, Inoue would eventually go on to Studio Ghibli, working on the film Whisper of the Heart. There would be another collaboration with Roumain Victor Pujabe, a programmer responsible for interactive storybook versions of both Robinson Crusoe and The Little Prince. In their collaborative game Lulu, the player can click on an interactive storybook and watch animations and short video clips. Similarly, there would be a kind of interactive cartoon produced in conjunction with Group TAC for the PlayStation called Are Moikore mo Mamotaru, a comical retelling of Japanese folklore with a lot of visual gags. One final collaboration was with the DJ Tetsuya Komuro. Gobble Screen is an odd 3D adventure game where the player takes on a role of a pair of magic shoes. The shoes travel through a television to various worlds, and interacting with objects in these worlds will cause the player to collect CDs. Collect enough CDs, and a music video of one of the record producer's bands will play on the screen. Since there's barely any text to begin with in this game, it's very playable as an import. For the Sega Saturn, there would be one collaborative game called Rampo. Rampo was produced alongside the 1994 surrealist mystery film that was made in celebration of the writer's 100th anniversary. But it uses a lot of the same characters and actors to tell a whole new story, in which the player must investigate a murder at a boarding house, and later a second murder at a mansion. It plays like a cross between Mansion of Hidden Souls and 380,000 Kilometers of Void, with typical FMV adventure game gameplay, mixed in with the ability to respond positively or negatively to situations. At the very end of the game, the player is judged on their performance and detective ability. There was also Murder on the Eurasia Express, a full-motion video game with a cast of many contemporary programmers, idols, and Japanese horror actresses. On a train from China to Europe, a class trip is interrupted by the finding of a murdered man in a train cabin. With the help of one of the students, the junior teacher, who is also a detective because it's that kind of game, must piece together the murder in the 2 hours they have before the train arrives at its destination. Murder on the Eurasia Express is very cheesy, with no one really acting very well save one or two characters. While the adventure genre would be absolutely dominant in the generation of the PlayStation and Saturn for System SACOM, there were a few miscellaneous titles that SACOM would work on that didn't fit into that. These included Great Hits, a combination RPG and music video creation game, with a highly bizarre art style, where the player is trying to get a score high enough to win awards. SACOM would also work on an arcade port of the racing game Rad Mobile. Retitled Gale Racer, it would have a lot of features cut out of it, disabling textures and halving the frame rate. Lastly, there would be two final games with Mark Flint involvement. The first, Running High, is a racing game which pits people in mech suits against each other. It's actually kind of a hidden gem, with incredibly fast gameplay and a pulsing soundtrack. It's a little difficult and rough around the edges, but it was a nice surprise from the studio, and a much better racing game than Gale Racer. The last was Fakedown, a cancelled project involving Katsuhiro Otomo that would have had Mark Flint in a major production role. SACOM would phase out of the business at this point, only working as a contractor on some titles, contributing to Deep Fear, and also to some of the cutscene animation for the Dreamcast game Blue Stinger, as well as doing programming work on a farming sim called Astronoka. They still exist as a company similar to their original inception, selling USB boards and other circuitry and parts. They don't seem to have any interest in reviving their software days, though, with a large portion of their library now the property of Project Egg and D4 Enterprise. People who worked for SACOM tended to go on to do some pretty amazing things. According to Ogino, Mark Flint now works in AI research, and a recent Japanese gaming magazine also backs up that statement. Akira Yamaoka needs no introduction, having worked on the Silent Hill games and many others. Other notable System SACOM employees that went on to do interesting things include Kiyoshi Sakai, the creator of the Umahara Kamasei games. When talking about leaving System SACOM, Ogino said, "One day, I took a moment to calmly observe the company. SACOM was no longer the paradise I had once thought it to be. Perhaps there never really was a paradise to begin with. It's possible that the place where we gathered, the Ryokoku Ueno building, a haven where young people of the same generation gathered to create games away from the eyes of adults, was a unique space. However, even in that place, there were people who could think only about creating interesting games. It was a stress-free place for creating things. That is an unchangeable fact. What is lost cannot be regained. However, new things can be created. The world must always be rebuilt." The game industry back then was much more relaxed than it is today. While there was overtime and such, console game development had a definitive end, so after reaching the master version, we could relax for a while. The company generally allowed us to work freely and took care of responsibilities in the background. There was no stress in the development environment, and everyone was primarily focused on how to make the game more enjoyable. The boundaries between programmers, designers, and planners were almost non-existent, and everyone was a game creator. Making games and playing games were both activities enjoyed to the fullest. This might have been due to youth, but I believe it's still possible to create such an environment even now. As someone who experienced such a place, I'd like to think if there's something I can do, even if it's quite late, now that I've passed 45. While System SACOM was never quite as large or as famous as its contemporaries, the software they created proved a lot of things that were very influential to the industry. From the work of Mark Flint showing the PC-98's value as a gaming platform, to the NovelWare series showing that games can have deeper and more mature stories, to their experiments from the Sega CD to the PlayStation showing the viability of 3D graphics in adventure games. Their impact was felt across the years of their releases, and while they would only be in the industry for a portion of their corporate lifetime, the work that System SACOM did made them a major participant despite their small stature, setting the foundations of the genres that they touched for years to come. See you next time.